I want to welcome everyone for this webinar, the ones that just joined the room. My name is Marcio Gagliato. I'm a member of MHPSS.net team. I'm connecting from Brazil. And today we have this very special webinar with very special presenters. And I'm really proud also to share the facilitation role with Peter Ventevogel, which is a very familiar name in the MHPSS field. So just to give you a few tips before we engage officially, we have received, because the ones that are familiar with this platform notice that we have changed the platform per se. So there is an option that you can you should change. If you go to the right screen to the settings, you have an option there that is notification configuration. You can change the notification there because people, they get really disturbed. By default, it will come any kind of message that comes on chat is going to produce a sound, is going to produce a visual thing that is going to might disturb the presentation. So I suggest to all the participants that you have this option, and you can do it only from your end. This webinar is being recorded. You can see that you have the chat box as well. Probably you can see all the interactions, and do use this space to make your question, do use this space to make your comment, to interact with each other. And yes, today with this very special participation facilitating this webinar as well, Peter, I hand over to you.
Great. Can you all see me? It seems so, huh? So I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm getting pretty excited about this unique webinar. I see more and more names coming up from people whom I worked with in the past or more recently. I see Catherine Penterbrick, professor at Yale University. Great that you're here. I see Pat Omidian, who did such beautiful work in Afghanistan, and I will stop now, otherwise I get overexcited. This webinar is indeed important because I think the topic that we're going to discuss is a little bit of an area in humanitarian work. When I was the editor of the journal Intervention, we had about 6-7 years ago an article written by Allie Shafer, who was with World Vision at that time, who's now with WHO, who wrote about how strange it is that spirituality and faith are areas that are neglected within humanitarian work. If you want to read it, you should go to the journal Intervention, www.interventionjournal.org, and then go to the archive box. You will find it in issue 8.2, 2010. I mention it because her article provoked a lot of reactions. So in one of the later issues, I think issue 9.1 in 2011, we collected some of the reactions, and I want to read just one sentence from Grace Onyango from Uganda, who wrote, "I have always wondered why an area that is an essential part of people's culture and way of life is so often neglected within humanitarian work." And these were words spoken by a very seasoned humanitarian worker who was in the field of humanitarian work for 30 years. So there is really an issue here. So it's great that we see that over the last years, the topic gets a bit more attention. And I hope this will be the start of an ongoing dialogue to actually engage in a more thorough way with the faith of the people who are affected by emergencies, as well as with the resources that are present within the communities of conflict and emergency affected populations, so the faith-based actors in the community. Now, I already speak too much. I shouldn't do that. I would like to introduce the two eminent speakers that we have. I'm really happy you could make time. We first have Michael French, who works in Geneva in the head office of the Lutheran World Federation. And he's responsible for quite an impressive portfolio covering Latin America and the Caribbean as a region, working on human rights-based approaches and also interfaith collaboration in humanitarian response. He has over 3 decades of experience in humanitarian and development work. And why he's invited here is because he was the project lead for a multi-agency team that produced the manual that we will talk more about today, which is this manual. I think you can find it by clicking on the link that was sent to you. It's quite a landmark publication. It was published a few months ago. A faith-sensitive approach in humanitarian response, guidance on mental health and psychosocial programming. Now, Michael is keen to see practical tools for humanitarian workers to make sense of this complicated world of faith and faith-based actors. So he's really been one of the driving forces behind this manual. So that's Michael, who will be our first speaker. We will then go to Alastair Ager, someone who perhaps hardly needs an introduction. I think many of you know him. I know him for a very long time. He's a kind of icon of MHPSS, if I may say so. He is the director of the Institute of Global Health and Development in Edinburgh at Queen Margaret University. He's also a professor of population and family health in New York at Columbia. And I think recently he has also been involved with DFID as an advisor for scientific, for research around humanitarian work. That's all nice, but the good thing is he is also a psychologist by profession. And he has always engaged with issues related to psychology and psychosocial support over the last decades. He worked with a lot of agencies as a consultant, too many to mention, and he has a he's very greedy in looking at new topics and new areas. But one of the areas that actually consistently comes back in his work is how to engage local faith communities in humanitarian responses. As a part of that, he does very interesting work with an initiative that I want to mention, the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. Maybe he will talk about that. That's an multi-agency collaboration that does interesting work. And if you have time to check it out on the website, please do so. Why he's here now today is particularly because he was, together with Wendy Ager and with Rebecca Horn, one of the consultants who actually drafted and redrafted this, this manual. So I'm really happy you could all be there. You two could both be there. What we will do, we'll have first 2 short presentations, and then we will start the discussion. So I would like to hand over now to Michael. Michael, are you ready?
I am ready, if you can hear me.
We can. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you also for giving the context. And I see that Allie Shafer is on the call, so it's good to welcome her. And thank you also for introducing my diverse roles and portfolio in my work. So as you can see, I'm not a psychosocial specialist, so I bow to all of your expertise. I have been involved in various pastoral roles though, and so I understand very much the importance of it. I'm going to make some initial comments about the conceptual approach behind this work, and then Alastair will move on to give some more detailed content. What we wanted to do was to provide a useful tool. We're conscious that there is lots of literature, but we wanted to put a useful tool in the hands of busy humanitarians trying to navigate this complicated world of faith, spirituality, and religion. The whole approach takes its cue from a community-based approach and a very people-centered approach. That's the point of the photo that you see on the front of the manual. We're aware that a people-centered approach, of course, is very much and rightly part of current humanitarian discourse, but let's focus on that young woman, and this is who it's all about. She's sitting there reading some kind of sacred text. We deliberately didn't want to specify what. It could be any, it could be something general, it could be some kind of spiritual inspiration, but it's about her. It's not about faith-based actors with whatever their agendas may be. It's about taking her seriously in all her dignity as a human being. and recognizing the fact that 95%, probably more, of the people to whom we are responding in a humanitarian crisis have some kind of faith identity or some kind of spirituality, however we define it, and that's going to be a key part of their coping mechanism. It's going to be a key part of their healing, of standing up to the stresses and the traumas that they're facing. It's going to be a key part of their well-being, and all of that is tied up with her faith identity. And so we need to be sensitive to her faith identity in order to respect her dignity. And as a lead on from there, we need therefore to understand the faith community that she may or may not be part of, and also the role of faith actors in that community. But above all, it starts with one person and is people-centered. That then leads on to the other aspect that's on the cover of that book, a faith-sensitive approach. And we think we may have coined that term, faith-sensitive, really to take the focus away from faith-based, because faith-based is loaded with all sorts of associations. For some people, perhaps a suspicion that there's a faith-based subtext, an agenda which is being promoted, an axe to grind. And we wanted to say it's not at all about that. It's about being sensitive to the phenomenon of faith, religion, spirituality. In that sense, is a little bit similar to gender sensitivity. It needs to be something to which we are sensitized and for which we have a vocabulary and which we can learn to navigate appropriately. Again, on that first slide and just inside the cover of the book and on the back, you'll see the various actors who have been involved here. What you don't see there is UNHCR, this is because of processes for actually putting logos on documents. But UNHCR's involvement, Peter's involvement, has been absolutely crucial in giving this the weight and the credibility which was so important to all of this. So we want to really thank Peter and we want to thank UNHCR for this. You'll then see there are also some faith-based organizations, some faith actors, Lutheran, Islamic Relief. This has come about partly out of a partnership between a Christian NGO organization and a Muslim one, which was deliberately done to show that there is no hidden agenda. But then going well beyond that, that there are other actors who have a more diverse agenda, who would not consider themselves to be religious, either by definition in their organization, and then some of those on our advisory group would not consider themselves to be religious. And the point there was that was exactly what was needed, because engaging with faith identity, tackling faith sensitivity needs to be a task for the whole of the humanitarian community. And so we have found that absolutely crucial and have been very grateful for that. Then you will see some of the other organizations, and there have been more who have been involved in bringing this work to the place where it is. And then you will see that this is about guidance on mental health and psychosocial programming. It's great that we're having this webinar on MHPSS.net, but we were very aware that psychosocial support is cross-sectoral, and in that sense it is an excellent entry point to be able to address the question of faith sensitivity in humanitarian response more broadly. And you will see that the structure of the manual reflects that cross-sectoral approach. Peter referred to the fact that in the past, for the humanitarian sector to be able to articulate anything about faith was seen as controversial and very difficult. And that was the background to the article that Allie wrote some while back. A sort of uneasiness with religion and faith and spirituality, but also, of course, stemming from humanitarian principles of impartiality, non-proselytization. But in some senses, to such an extent that we have been lacking a vocabulary because we've not known what to say about it. An example of this, and this is no criticism at all, in the previous edition of the Sphere Handbook, there were references to faith, religion, and so on in the context of appropriate funerals, which is great. If you'll excuse the joke, we joked that it was all right to talk about religion when people were dead. Then there was some progress to talk about response, taking into account faith and spirituality when in palliative care. So in some sense, it was okay to talk about religion when people were dead or dying. But of course, the point that some of us wanted to make was that faith, spirituality, religion is part of people's identity when they are alive, and therefore it is something that we have to take into account. We need to have a vocabulary for it, and we therefore need to understand faith identity, faith communities, their role and the nature of their contribution to response. As has been mentioned, we had the support of really some very eminent consultants, and Wendy Ager, Rebecca, who I think is on the call here, and Alastair, who you will hear from shortly, and drawing also on a growing body of work, all with the intention of producing a useful tool. So let me then go through quickly the stages that this work took. In developing guidelines, there was first of all a desk review. I think it may not be very visible, but it should be in a title at the top left there. It's very small. Oh, sorry, it's here. A desk review, and that was very important in setting out the context, and it has led to an article which Alastair will mention. And then a draft of the guidelines was produced to start guiding us, very much based, as you will see, on the structure which Alastair will refer to. And having produced that draft, which was itself done through consultation with various field offices and already drew on a lot of input from places like Nepal and Jordan and Kenya, the draft was then field tested and sent out to these different programs, existing ones, some new initiatives set up, and there were different opportunities for colleagues in the field to feedback, a review guide for section by section feedback on the guidelines, and then a field testing guide for agencies in making action plans. And then, as you can see here, field testing across 4 settings, and deliberately looking for ones that had a variety of rural, urban settings, with agencies of different kind of faith backgrounds or none. And a number of these, of course, you can see identified there, certain agencies, but they were very much working together with all sorts of different actors. And therefore leading to the tool that we are talking about today. But then in terms of that wider debate, we were pleased, gratified to see some references in the revision to the Sphere Handbook, talking about religion, spirituality, faith. Towards the beginning of the handbook, you will see that there is this section here which is talking about spiritual and religious identity, and we're glad to see that there is progress in that sense, in being able to talk about and articulate these matters. That's me, and I'll hand over to Alastair. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Peter, for introducing Michael there, for laying the foundations and the philosophy, the perspective behind the work. And I wanted to pay particular thanks to Marcio and Renata for convening this group. And a little bit like Peter hinted at the beginning, I feel quite humbled by the people in the room. I think it's just 100 people now. There's a certain intimacy of doing this as a webinar. And I hope what we share in the next another 20 minutes or so stirs some valuable discussion within the group. And very much, I think what I want to share over the next little while is around a structure to take forward this discussion, to build upon those principles that Michael has just outlined. And I'm going to do it really with respect to 2 documents. First of all, there is this paper which is in press with intervention, but there's a larger review that it's drawn from. But I want to use the structure of this paper that you'll shortly find as open access as a way of how we felt that as we went through the literature, we should construct the challenge that there is for humanitarian workers. And I'm going to go similarly in a structured way through the guidelines themselves. So this paper, sort of the case for psychosocial programming being done with faith sensitivity, is basically argued around 5 good reasons why we should be doing this, and then 3 reasons possibly why we don't. And that's the rhetorical structure I want to briefly review, because I think it perhaps helps us then understand the challenges of developing guidelines and what those guidelines should demonstrate. The first reason where we feel the literature suggests we should be doing this is as a field we've already committed to do so. Within the ISC guidelines, there is significant emphasis on, in general, cultural appropriateness, but quite frequently that cultural appropriateness is seen to relate to religious traditions, spirituality, religious groups, etc., in terms of healing traditions and healing practices. So this is not a radical departure for the field. This is not, in principle at least, any major step forward. It's just understanding how a commitment that's been made in the guidelines might be made more substantive. I have to say that one of the most interesting things in talking with experienced consultants in the psychosocial field in the development of this work was to ask how many had mapped local indigenous and traditional healing systems, as in action sheet 6.4, and not many in reality had done. But if they had done, the follow-up question was, how then was that mapping of traditional indigenous local structures then used in the development of some form of humanitarian response? And there were negligible examples at that time, and it may be as a reason you'll see later that they were simply not documented. But when, even if we understood how local populations drew upon religious belief, spirituality in coping, we seldom really connected with it in terms of our response. And that seems a little odd given the commitment of the guidelines to be community-based. The first reason we're saying to engage in this is because of the guidelines already taking us in that direction. The second argument, and I'll cover this a little bit more later, is that we should, if we have a broader understanding of requirements of humanitarian law and principles, we should recognize the very special place that religious belief has in our understanding of human rights and dignity. And essentially, most humanitarians are very familiar with the sense of being free from religion, of having someone else's religion imposed upon them, and non-discrimination. And we completely recognize the importance of that and the value of that. And in our engagement with humanitarian workers and programs, that was a high level of sensitivity and awareness of the importance of being free from imposition or free from discrimination. But I have to say there was much less awareness of freedom for religion, of religious expression and identity. And the classic example, which some may have heard me talk about in the past in terms of my own work, is a lack of engagement really with the principles of the Convention of the Rights of the Child in duties in supporting parents and children in their own religious formation, spiritual formation, and in the concerns of parents to support that. And so what we're encouraging in the guidelines is a fuller understanding of the impulse of humanitarian law and humanitarian principles, particularly in its understanding of dignity. A third of the 5 reasons for doing faith-sensitive psychosocial programming is, as was mentioned right at the start of the presentation, about a general awareness that religion is an active source of coping in many contexts. We don't have to say it is for all people and in all populations and in all contexts, but we can say that in many circumstances we're aware that people draw upon this tradition, upon these practices, upon these beliefs. And if we're going to connect with that, we need to understand in a more effective way of how we connect with those forms of practice and coping. A fourth principle, which has become increasingly aware of, is the notion that local faith actors often have a comparative advantage in humanitarian settings. That might be because of proximity, it might be because of longevity, but essentially in terms of food assistance, in terms of shelter, there's a wide recognition that local faith actors, and this is related to the work of the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities that Peter mentioned earlier, local faith actors are increasingly being recognized as a key part of the humanitarian response landscape, particularly in early days of an emergency. But there's less awareness of how that comparative advantage of coherence in worldview, coherence in understanding of structures might be drawn upon in terms of supporting humanitarian response. And fifthly and finally, this is an agenda that is not any longer in any way marginal. The amount of interest in this webinar partly reflects that a deeper understanding of how to engage with local communities, including local faith communities, is increasingly embedded in quite significant agendas. The most obvious one is in terms of the localization agenda, where an awareness of the understanding of local structures, local capacities is crucial to the commitments coming from the World Humanitarian Summit. And as Peter mentioned earlier on, the percentage sometimes noted varies from 84% to 90% from the Pew Foundation, but basically that religious affiliation is a major identifier, a major resource that many communities draw upon. And within a broader understanding of psychosocial support, it clearly makes sense to connect to that sense of identity and belonging. And then some of the pictures on this page, the picture in the top right-hand corner is from the World Humanitarian Summit, but from in the center and the lower part is from the UNHCR High Commissioner's Dialogue on Faith and Protection in 2012, which was really a groundbreaking event for a UN agency clearly wedded to a secular framing, an independent framing of humanitarian assistance, seeing that there needed to be much closer partnership with local faith actors, as many other actors, and an important recognition that the secular framing of humanitarian assistance was often not perceived of, or in practice neutral, but somehow exclusionary of faith actors in some real way. And so it has led to UNHCR thinking how, as clearly not a faith-based organization, it works even-handedly and openly and explicitly with faith-based actors. So the idea is that the impulse behind these guidelines is 5 very good reasons for working in a faith-sensitive way as psychosocial practitioners, but we also recognize perhaps 3 major obstacles to our engagement with that. And I'll just cover these very briefly and then go onto the guidelines themselves. The first is that it is very clear that whilst some may be able to cite religious practice as an adaptive coping strategy and the value of that, there is evidence in some contexts of religion as a fomenter of conflict, as undermining agency, basically as a source of maladaptive coping. And most psychosocial practitioners have been aware of religious leaders and religious practices somehow undermining groupings or undermining principles that we might feel are well established in terms of dignity, but also in terms of our scientific understanding of what underpins well-being. So to engage with faith sensitively doesn't mean that we have to think that everything that comes from a faith impulse is good and acceptable. It's acknowledging that in some circumstances, inevitably, if we're engaging with faith actors, we need to be sensitive also to the maladaptive understanding and adopting of some principles and practices. And then specifically, there's concern, a sort of a second concern about the compromise of impartiality and the sense that religious actors will deliver aid to their own and exclude not to their own. And indeed, the impulse to proselytize that Peter mentioned as being one that is seen to be coercive in the delivery of assistance. The third and final obstacle that we see, and this was borne out in field work that many faith actors, humanitarian agencies engaging with faith actors wrestle with, is that in weighing those 5 good reasons and those 2 challenges, there isn't really much guidance and structure to document practice or to disseminate practice, to give some framework to be able to negotiate those delicate judgments about engagement or non-engagement, or the form of engagement, the strategy of engagement at a local level. And it's really this third challenge in the context of the 5 advantages and those other 2 concerns that was the major impulse to the construction of these guidelines, which are seeking to be acutely practical, but addressing these broader shifts in thinking, seeking to engage with the lives of individuals very much as individuals of people of potential faith and diverse faith, but in a way that is open to their spirituality, faith, and the resources they might draw upon from that. So, briefly, what are these guidelines? Well, Peter has given the background to their construction and the agencies and the process of developing them, as indicated by that slide. But one thing to emphasize just with that content sheet is a decision made very early on to make these guidelines a supplement, essentially, to the existing ISC framework. This is not a rival faith-based set of principles drawn from a different cosmology or a different theology. They're intended to be entirely coherent with the impulse of the original guidelines, but acknowledging that we have not advanced in the last decade as well as we might have done when we expected, might have expected, when we talked about engaging with communities in terms of understanding their cultural practices, religious practices of healing. And so we've explicitly wedded the guidance to each of the sections of the existing guidance and thought systematically about what would faith sensitivity look like in each of these areas. So I'm just going to give an example of the protection and human rights standards section. You'll know that's section 3 of the ISC guidelines. And we follow the same format in each of these sections. First of all, the section A, how does this relate to the ISC MHPSS guidelines? It contextualizes what existing guideline is trying to be fulfilled or supported or informed by this. We're not pulling away from that guideline, we're trying to fulfill it. And then it provides some basic review of evidence drawn from the literature review. And for those of you that have good eyesight, it's a bit challenged, but in that section B, you might just note, here is that principle that I mentioned earlier on, that an awareness of human rights standards should make us both aware of the need to ensure that people are not discriminated on the basis of their religious affiliation, that's the freedom from religion, but also that there should be support for the expression of religious identity and the respect for religious conviction and practice. And that was also something that we need to consider of how our response reflects that in terms of human dignity. Then section C begins to give, in a similar format to the existing ISC guidelines, a principle that might be used in terms of trying to ensure that, in this case, protection standards and human rights norms are being considered, sensitive to local religious belief and practice, and in a way engage with the religious actors. And the blue is the sort of the principle, if you like, and then the bullet points are recommended actions in fulfillment of that, many of which have been field tested. We then give grade text to a box text of an example. This is the text highlighted there, is the use of language from the Quran in terms of looking at gender-based violence and the rights of women, and how one agency has worked in that way, gives references and resources to follow things up, And included in that is some case examples drawn either from our fieldwork or from the broader literature review, again seeking a broad range of contexts, a broad range of religious affiliations, to begin to build the evidence base of what seems to be potentially effective to explore in modeling great sensitivity to faith. In some areas, for example, here, in terms of identifying from humanitarian law and other sources, key principles with respect to religious practice have ended up gazetting or including some information that we think is particularly important to highlight as a resource. So if people in the field, we want this manual to be dog-eared and become well used, this is something that is a useful source to check back how the Geneva Convention or how the International Convention on the Rights of the Child links in with the issues that are being talked about. That's for section 3. I want to just show you for another section. So this is the food security and nutrition section. Similarly, it has a link to the guidelines, then talks about what we know about religion, food and nutrition, and its link to religious practice and the importance of it and the understanding of it that can be informed from religious practice and belief. Give some case examples of use and some guidelines on implementation and resources. This has been field tested, but we see this as the beginning of a story rather than the end of a story. And we really want to feel that these guidelines are used, and in due course there is much more material that we can draw on to supplement, to document effective practice, including areas where there are challenges which we recognize will be the case. But hopefully it's a framework with a clear set of principles in which we can begin to embody some of the things that Peter and Michael were talking about right at the start of the workshop, which is really making sure that our MHPSS work is focused on the individual within their community, their resources, their agenda, their cosmology or theology as a resource that they will draw upon in terms of their overall coping and ways of approaching the challenge that they face in any humanitarian context. Okay, that's me done, and I'm going to hand over back to Peter to moderate some of the discussion. It's great to see some questions coming in.
Thank you very much, Alastair. Thank you very much, Michael, as well, for this crisp and clear presentation. It's good to see it all handily laid out. But of course, if you really want to know more, you have to read the guidelines or the guidance. But let's start a discussion. We have a few questions that we pulled out of the chat box. And the first one is a question to Michael and comes from Ruma Gondaker. Apologies, I may not really pronounce your name very well. She works in the Rohingya response in Bangladesh. And her question is, how can responders understand the mechanisms of faith sensitivity in communities, even if the responders are from the same religious background? So do you have or propose any tool or dynamic to facilitate MHPSS professionals to understand what faith sensitivity is? Could you reflect a bit on that, Michael?
Thank you, and thank you to Ruma for the question. Yes, there is some content in the manual about precisely that. I think one of the key things here is we were very aware of is that response and understanding the mechanisms is very context specific. With most faiths or religions or spiritualities, even though they may appear to be hierarchical and top down, actually that is not the case. So if you are going to try to engage with the reality of them, then and also the possibilities for engaging with those communities at the local level, it all starts at the local level, and it can be very context specific. And so that is the driver, I suppose. That is the aim in having a manual, a tool which can just be put in the hands of people who are working on the ground. A section which addresses some of these things is the first chapter, in fact, which corresponds to one of the first sectors of response. I don't know if you can see, well, I don't think you can see, but if I hold this up, it's looking at chapter 1, which is about coordination, and it follows the same kind of logic as Alastair has just described for other sections, but is talking, for example, about how to identify local faith leaders and faith communities in order to engage in coordination structures. How do you decide that this particular faith community is good to talk to? How do you decide who you can work with? What are the criteria? That's complicated, and I guess the response is that you have to do so at the local level. There are some suggestions in the manual for some principles to guide that, some comments on when not to engage, and behind and underlying all that, it would be humanitarian and human rights criteria, but trying to adopt a faith-sensitive vocabulary. In the engagement, I think one thing to comment is that it's important that people understand that faith communities, local expressions of that, are not static, immutable, monolithic. This is actually a process of engaging, and there can be mutual change on both sides, both through humanitarian actors and those faith communities.
Thank you very much. Alastair, would you want to react on this point?
Just very briefly, there's a term used a little bit in the guidance, which is around faith literacy, but I think early on, and there are others very much in the humanitarian field with the same view, we wanted to get away from this being a manual that was sort of Islam 101 or Buddhism for beginners, this sense to which you needed to, if you understood a few key facts, then you could negotiate local religious practice. I think the whole impulse is really around a community-based approach and understanding that the way things work locally may be quite different. And so that religious literacy, and this is reflected in some work being done at Yale University with the Divinity School on religious literacy and humanitarian leadership, to reflect a good listening skill and a good synthesis skill as being literate, rather than knowing things already. And that's really the impulse that's reflected in the guideline. It's about convening with religious leaders and understanding that might mean meeting with women, it might mean meeting with teenagers, it might be meeting a range of actors and understanding something of the local dynamics, challenging as that is, rather than assuming that if you've read a few things, you will know how to navigate it.
Okay, yeah, that's clear, Alastair, but I got a question from Christine Harris that's actually related to this point. She's a social worker in Ireland, and yeah, she asks about resources, and I think that question will come back if you are preparing to go to a humanitarian emergency, for example, to say, what can I read to get to understand things? And I get your point. You say, talk with people, see how faith matters in the lives of people, they will tell you. But Christine's question is there any resource that outlines the beliefs and principles of the religion in a certain country and of the sponsoring agency's religion, so that we as workers and as researchers have a basic knowledge? Now, what's your response to that? Would you say then don't do that at all? Or would you say, yes, there are some resources that are actually useful to read in order to better understand the faith of the people that you work with?
I think it's a very challenging question, because I certainly wouldn't say there is nothing that you can read that would be of value. And clearly, if you're going to work in a largely Buddhist affiliated country and you're deploying there not having experience working there as an international humanitarian, then clearly to do readings around culture and religious practice makes a lot of sense in that context. And there are resources clearly relevant to that. And some of the Yale project and some of the work of the JLI in terms of its developing a religious literature.
What is the JLI, Alastair?
So this is the Joint Learning Initiative, on faith in local communities, will develop sort of materials which will guide in that way. But it's really back to, I think, Michael's earlier point, which is about faith being relevant to coping in adversity because it is emergent, because it is dynamic, because it is negotiated. It's not a static set of beliefs. That's how it interacts with psychosocial coping. And that seems such an important principle that the idea that you've got it if you've read the book seems such an important thing to state. And so actually going with humility and ignorance and meeting and saying, can you explain to me? Can you show me? Can I observe? Seems to me a very appropriate humanitarian response to learn about local coping and to begin to then understand how external humanitarian assistance can bolster, can support, can strengthen those existing ways of thinking and working, rather than a parallel universe that just doesn't connect at all.
Thank you very much. If I may add a little bit from my own experience, is because this question comes up very often in the sense that people would like to prepare to understand their the persons of concern in a better way. And your point, I think, is very eloquently elaborated. So don't think that if you read the book about Buddhism, you understand the Buddhist point of view on this or that. So but I do think that sometimes it may be helpful to synthesize or summarize what is known about the culture and context and religion of people in a specific situation. So there have been some literature reviews by WHO, by UNHCR as well, on, for example, culture and context of, and then we can say, Syrian refugees, Rohingya refugees, a document that was recently produced, Somali refugees, another primer that was recently produced. And I do agree with you that the difficulty is, of course, is to present the view of the Rohingya people. So if you look at the primer on culture and context of Rohingya refugees, you actually see emphasized that the Rohingya community is diverse and experiences of displacement are different. So Rohingyas in Malaysia and the ones who just have arrived in Bangladesh may be different, and may also think different about traditional concepts around religion and tradition. But anyway, I'm not a speaker, but I just couldn't resist. Yeah. Alastair, I have another question from you that comes from Kenya, where we have Gemma Huldley. I'm not sure she's still in Kenya, but she did research in Kenya. And she asks the following question. My own research in Kenya discusses how aid workers from the global south are often guided by faith themselves in their motivations and in their own coping mechanisms. So could you perhaps speak a little bit about the role of faith for staff in humanitarian agencies and how this may be better recognized in humanitarian programming? It's maybe a question for both of you. I think Michael's, I would like to hear what Michael thinks about that as well. Go ahead.
I'm very happy to, and thanks, Gemma, for the question. I think I need to take a little step back to answer it in the most full way, which is that I've had discussions with a number of southern, but it could actually be northern based humanitarian workers who are people of faith, who understand their work as people of faith, who work in camps or other contexts with people of faith, either similar or different, but don't use faith language at all to describe that experience. Certainly in reports to UNHCR, that religious experience is translated into a secular frame, and many would say that's a good thing. That sort of protects from proselytism and protect. We've got this neutral language, secular framing that keeps us that people can translate into. And I'm very much channeling the work of Charles Taylor, which has been influenced in the social science and humanities in the 21st century, to query that idea that this secular language is really completely neutral and doesn't reflect certain Western values and marginalize other ways of thinking. And so if you approach this idea that a worker having religious views potentially interferes with their real work or strengthens their real work, which is somehow expressed in other terms, you're always going to see religion as something that could interfere with professional behavior. But if you have that idea that professional behavior is formed by values, and those could be Marxist values, or they could be values of feminism, or they could be values of Islam, we're in a much more post-secular, complicated world, arguably more exciting world, where we're trying to find common cause with people that might be motivated by a wide variety of actions. And it's not to then dispense with the secular framing, but it's not to see it as just a sanitized, safe area. It's to say that we are drawn into this field because of our values, and to be more explicit about those values, whether they're religious or not, may be quite a helpful thing for us to then be able to engage with the communities with whom we're seeking to work, who may share those values and principles or who may not. So I hope that's an answer to it, which is that it can be helpful, but we need to understand the secular framing of humanitarianism and the challenge for that to really understand it.
Yes, I have a comment in the box that actually relates to this point from Frank Dimmock, who says about this point, my experience with South Sudanese refugees clearly points to the advantage of the faith practices of aid workers themselves in connecting and establishing trust with refugees. So he emphasizes the point that if you have aid workers who actually share similar backgrounds, that this can really help in establishing trust with refugees. What do you both think of that?
If I can come in on that, I think I would obviously echo what Alastair has said. I think we have detected often an oversensitivity on the part of those who have aid workers who have some kind of faith identity about not saying anything about it because of respecting humanitarian principles and perceptions that this will be seen very negatively. And what I think we're trying to all do is to open up a space where this is seen as something which just is. It is something that is part of people's identity, and that to speak about it is just part of being human. I think what that enables us to do is it enables aid workers themselves not to see faith as being something which is potentially threatening in a proselytizing sense and therefore to be avoided. It helps them to be more self-aware and self-analytical about their own spectacles, which is true of anybody, whatever their philosophical, emotional, cultural background, and that is important. And clearly having a faith sensibility and understanding that somebody with whom you are talking has the same can be an important connection.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for this response. I have another question, which is to some extent, yeah, it's all related, I think. It's from Dr. Mohammed Abu Hilal. I'm very happy he's here. He's a Syrian psychiatrist who, as many other Syrian professionals, became a refugee himself, but continued his work. And he did a survey within the Syrian context, and he writes to us that he found that more than half of the respondents to his questionnaire, who are all MHPSS professionals, MHPSS professionals, that they included religious activities in their MHPSS and protection projects, even though such activities were not always present in the original proposal. And more than half of those professionals do not report such activities related to religion and faith to their donors. Could you comment on that? The fact that actually people do more, but perhaps hide it, or So who can I give the floor? Maybe Michael first?
Yeah, I think this came out interestingly in the launch of the manual of the UNHCR NGO consultations. It's a question of who does what, who is the appropriate actor to actually provide, if you like, spiritual activities or support. I think there is a real sensitivity here in still keeping a balance between the humanitarian mandate, I'd say a tension between the humanitarian mandate and then the more overtly spiritual mandate. And I think some of the resolution in that can be that, and this is a reason why one would seek to engage faith communities and faith actors locally in response, it is that they are the ones best placed to provide that support. And then humanitarians can see their role as making sure that people have access to that support. That would be the way I would nuance that.
Alastair, would you like to reflect?
No, absolutely, to reinforce that. I think in the early work, one of the most influential examples we came across was actually the work of the American Red Cross, which has its spiritual care strategy. Now, American Red Cross is a very secular organization. It doesn't do religion, but it sees religion is relevant to the people that are affected by disasters, and it has a procedure of identifying who has spiritual religious needs and feels an obligation to refer them or to connect them with appropriate resources, exactly what Michael said. That's what we do in most other areas. We don't necessarily deliver it all ourselves, but we see it as a need, and we feel a responsibility to connect people to resources that meet that need, but we seem to have been particularly reluctant to do it in the context of religious experience and in terms of spirituality. So I think we're just trying to emphasize the potential of an integrated needs assessment, an integrated community-based program of seeing this as a legitimate area that you would connect to relevant local resources with the same degree of scrutiny that you would have for schooling or you'd have for health provision, but you'd see it as part of the mandate.
Thank you very much. I see we are already approaching the hour. I have at least one question I would like to mention, and then I look at Marcio and the other moderators from MHPSS.net to tell us if we have more time or not. But there is one issue that I really want to address, because we've now talked quite a lot about positive effects of faith and faith-based actors. But there is also, of course, another side. And there is a question from Ide Reader, who works with GIZ in Kenya. And she asks, how do you shape faith-based interventions in a context where institutional religion, for example, the church, has been a bystander, a perpetrator of specific violence? For example, she mentioned the Rwandan genocide. So how do you deal with that when faith and organized religion has become tainted? Could you briefly react on that? Who wants to start?
I can jump in. I think we've tried to model two things in the guidelines. So one is that there are red lines or circumstances where you, as a local humanitarian, you would say, because of the practices of this organization, we cannot associate with it. But I think we've tried to suggest that the number of times you do that is minimized, that we will not have influence if we do not connect. And you will not protect communities from religious organizations by ignoring their practices and us having no way of connecting with them. So the principle is really to seek to connect and engage and to weigh and evaluate, but clearly there are circumstances when you would say, we cannot even invite that group to this meeting because by so doing so we would be seen to be condoning some practices that are unacceptable. But we're encouraging a greater commitment to reaching out to organizations with the view of having influence and learning of potential concerns that one could then intervene and support with respect.
Thank you. Michael, would you like to react on this as well?
Yes, I think that both the red lines, but also then the engagement, which means that it is a process of potentially challenging positions that may have been taken by that particular faith community, or even the local expression of it, because the local expression of it may not be the official line, but it may simply be what a local leader or a local community is choosing to interpret. So, for example, there have been cases of challenging patriarchal interpretations of sacred scriptures in such a way as to actually bring enlightenment, I suppose, about the role of women and appropriate relationships and masculinities. I think of some work that our friends from Islamic Relief have been involved in, which has been around the interpretation of sacred scripture with regard to women and women's roles and so on, which has helped local leaders to understand different dimensions of this. I think of work done by World Vision through the Channels of Hope program, where they're actually sensitizing local faith leaders in terms of things that we would consider to be human rights and humanitarian norms.
Great. Great. Thanks a lot. We have crossed the hour mark. It goes incredibly fast. I'd like to hand over to Marcio to let us know, for those who want to leave after the hour, where they can find the webinar and how things go on. Marcio, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me, Peter?
Absolutely, we can.
Super. So yes, thanks a lot, Peter. What we can do now is that we have reached so fast. This 1 hour passed so fast this time, and I can see so many critical comments, contributions, and we have to go to another webinar next year for sure to continue discussing this topic. I want to encourage everyone before you leave that don't forget our usual push that you please respond to our SurveyMonkey, which is a feedback for this webinar, which is help us a lot to get a sense of how to improve and also the challenge and achievement for this webinar. What we can do now, it's a final round of comments from each of you, including you, Peter. I would and where you can conclude this webinar and your final comments. And thanking again very much you, Alastair, and Michael for this incredible opportunity.
Great. Marcio, can you say before we leave something about where participants may be able to find the recordings?
Oh, thank you so much for reminding me that, Peter. So basically the webinar will be up in our YouTube channel. We have a YouTube channel, MHPSS.net. If you search there, you can find this webinar and all the previous webinars should be posted there by the end of the day today. And also at our Facebook page and MHPSS.net site as well.
Okay, and then there was so many valuable things that were said in the chat box and also resources that were mentioned over the hour. I just wondered, in MHPSS.net on the website, is there a special section with tools, or is there a community of practice around this topic already? Marcio, could you reflect on that?
I mean, we do have a dedicated space for the guidelines that we have done the promotion in our site, Peter. I haven't tracked down how the interactions and how people they have been used that space, you know. But the MHPSS.net under that page with the guidelines, with the orientation, the faith manual, we do have space for a chat and forum interaction where people they can interact and participate and make their comments. Actually, from this webinar, I'm going to make a suggestion that we collect all these questions and we post theirs in the forum part of this, so people they keep tracking. Perfect. Because the questions are quite insightful as well as they are.
Yeah, that would be great, Marcio. Thank you.
Wonderful. Michael, could you do you have some final words?
Yes, I think it is. We just wanted to convey the message that you can do something. We were acutely aware that we wanted to produce something for humanitarian workers who may be facing a crisis, 50,000 people arriving tomorrow, funding proposals to get in by midnight. And the last thing you want to say to those people when they're trying to engage with faith and faith sensitivity is, oh, it's all so complicated. You really need to kind of spend a year kind of reading papers about this. We wanted to be able to give them some tools and say, you can actually do something and you can get on with it. And so that is the encouragement we hope comes from this little manual.
Great. Alastair?
Well, and just to reinforce that, but I suppose I see this as an early part of the journey, and what essentially encouraging people to do is to use the guidelines to inhabit the promise of the first 5 reasons we should be doing MHPSS programming with faith sensitivity, but begin to document our experience of wrestling with the other 3 challenges, including partiality, including negative aspects of religious coping. So let's build our knowledge base of how to navigate this by being an active community and sharing those lessons.
Great. Then I will not say much. I just want to reiterate that it was a pleasure to moderate this webinar. And I would also like to say that for me, the most important takeaway point is that engagement with faith and actually developing faith sensitivity is not just for organizations that have their own roots in this particular religion, but it's also, and perhaps particularly relevant for the other humanitarian agencies, such as we had a few examples, International Federation of the Red Cross, UNHCR. I think it's particularly also the general organizations that do not engage with one faith in particular that need to develop faith sensitivity in their programming. Having said that, thank you all very much. I think it's about time. A lot of people have already. So I would like to say thank you and goodbye to all the others, and see you at the next webinar.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Alastair, and thank you, Michael. Thank you for everyone that participated in this webinar. It has been an incredible participation. I just checked our registration channel, and we had indeed 250 participants that registrations. We had about more than 100 participants during this webinar, and from so many countries all over the world. Thank you once again. For this year, we don't have a webinar scheduled, but surely next year, early next year, you're going to hear from us again. Thank you very much, and bye for now.